Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Teresa Eder. I'm a program associate at the Global Europe program here at the Wilson Center. This week is Earth Week in the United States, and it is also Earth Optimism Week at the Smithsonian Institution, which the Wilson Center is a part of. And so we thought it would be a great idea to join forces with several European embassies in DC and to put on events that are dedicated more to climate solutions. So looking at what is actually happening right now and what are some innovations that might help us to mitigate climate change. We already had an event on oceans and climate on Monday and another one yesterday about the prospects for a hydrogen-powered economy. And our final event this week, but not our last one because we're going to continue this series throughout the year, is sponsored by the EU delegation in DC and the German and Danish embassy. So we're going to turn to another large puzzle piece in the fight against climate change, which is offshore wind power. We'll be talking about its potential, but also challenges, innovations on the horizon, and what Europe and the US can learn from each other to harness clean technologies. So let me briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. The first one is Damien Bednarz. He is the External Affairs Director at EnBW, which stands for Energie Baden-Württemberg. Welcome. Then we have with us Bill White. He serves as the head of US offshore wind for Offshore Renewables. And thirdly, we have Matt Morrissey. He's the head of market affairs and strategy at Ørsted Offshore North America. And for you, the audience, there is a way to engage with our panel. If you have a question for our panelists, you can send them to our email. And our email is GEP, which stands for Global Europe Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org. Or you can tweet us at Wilson Center GEP. So the email again is GEP@wilsoncenter.org. And don't hesitate to send us your questions. And now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Erin Baker, who brings a great deal of expertise to this topic. She's a professor of industrial engineering and operations research at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And she's also the director of the Wind Energy Fellows Program and the faculty director of the Energy Transition Institute. She will moderate today's panel, and I'll hand it over to you, Erin, now. So please take it away.
Thank you very much. So again, I'm Erin Baker. I just want to mention I'm also on the steering committee of the Wind Energy Center, which is the oldest academic wind energy research center in the US, and was founded by Bill Hieronymus, who first developed a serious concept for floating offshore wind in 1972. So we've been looking at this for a very long time. I'm very pleased to be here today to hear from our panelists about their perspectives on offshore wind in the US and Europe. Just want to give a little bit of background to set the stage. The offshore wind industry places wind turbines in the ocean in order to take advantage of the strong and consistent winds offshore, as well as the proximity of population centers. So for example, in the US, 1/3 of the population lives in counties that are adjacent to the ocean. There are now over 28 gigawatts of installed offshore wind plants or wind farms around the world, dominated right now by the UK, Germany, and China, with significant capacity in Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands. This is growing rapidly, but is still a fairly small amount. So to put it in perspective, the US has over 1,000 gigawatts of installed capacity for onshore wind and about 28 gigawatts of small scale solar. So that's the same as worldwide offshore wind. But there are ambitious goals. The EU has a goal of about 100 gigawatts by 2030. The US has a couple of small plants with about 40 megawatts. So a megawatt's 1,000th of a gigawatt. But there's many projects in process, and the Biden administration has announced a goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030. So that would be equivalent to have the US having as much offshore wind as in the rest of the world right now, and a streamlined federal approval process. So with that, I will hand it over to the panelists, and we're going to start with Damien. Can you start by just letting us know a little bit about yourself and also your perspective on the future of offshore wind energy?
Great. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to the Wilson Center and the European program for this opportunity to talk about a topic that me and my co-panelist here, Bill White, live and breathe every day. And so it's exciting to share this story and this opportunity with so many of you, both here in the US and globally. So quick little background, I'm Damien Bednarz. I'm the EnBW's North America's External Affairs Director. So I focus on a lot of the policy analysis and strategic communications work and telling our story here in the US. EnBW North America is a global clean energy developer focusing on bridging the divide between communities and building out a clean energy future. We're primarily focused on offshore wind here in the US, looking on both the east and west coasts. So we're looking at developing a floating technology that Aaron mentioned out there in Central California called Castle Wind, as well as highly focused in the New York, New Jersey area, and look standing up and meeting the Biden administration's ambitious and bold goals. There's a lot to say here. There's a lot to address in what's been happening in the past couple of weeks. I would say it's a tectonic shift in what's happened here in the US and the commitment that's come from the Biden administration of getting 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Ambitious, bold, but also very realistic. And I think you'll hear from us today about how we get there and how we build that coalition to make it a success. There's a lot of best practices out there in Europe, and they've definitely had the lead in this for a very long time. But there's a very American flavor to how we're going to bring this here in the US. And I think that's where we're excited. That's how we're very much interested in learning and sharing that experience here and standing up this industry that is a once in a generation economic opportunity, but it's also key to addressing our climate goals. And that's where everything kind of coincides. And so I think the outlook for offshore wind is very bright. I think there's an opportunity in establishing in the US far beyond where that opportunity will live on the coasts. And I'm looking forward to talking about that further with you all today. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
All right, thank you, Damien. So Bill, would you give us your perspective on future offshore wind industry?
All right, I'm off mute. Look at that. What a start. Bill White, head of U.S. Offshore Wind for Avangrid Renewables. Thank you for the introduction, Professor Baker and Teresa. Thanks to the Wilson Center and the European embassies. You know, I guess maybe just as a bit of background, I've been kind of in pursuit of this this white whale we call offshore wind in the United States for almost the last 15 years. We've been talking about it and thinking about it, and it's one of those rare situations, at least for some of us Americans who feel very good about ourselves and very good about our country. But this is really where, you know, Americans are going to be learning from the Europeans primarily. And you know, this is a 30-year industry that started in 1991 in Denmark with a very, very small little turbine just off the coast of Vindeby, and you know, it really wasn't even a megawatt of energy that they were producing back in, you know, 30 plus years ago. And so here we are, as Professor Baker said, we're 30 years into it. The Europeans are driving this industry, and of course, Asia is now starting to pick up. And of course, here in America, we've been treading water. We've been stalled. We've been doing a lot of talking, unfortunately. But we're now, you know, really almost kind of 15 years into this dream of really finally moving forward. You know, that is thanks to a lot of industry who have invested, primarily the states who have created a market for offshore wind. And then lastly, you know, we have a federal partner right now that sees offshore wind as a key part of the climate change agenda. So Avangrid Renewables, you know, we are part of the Iberdrola family. Many of the European people on this call will understand Iberdrola as kind of one of the largest companies in the world in the clean energy space, in the energy space and clean energy space, and is really kind of driving this opportunity both in Europe and here in the U.S. through our company Avangrid Renewables. We are, I guess, you know, we've got a pretty large portfolio, a 7.5 gigawatt portfolio of onshore wind and solar, but we're really kind of the pioneers in the U.S. market because of the joint venture we have with Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, known as Vineyard Wind. And so the Vineyard Wind project is the Vineyard Wind 1 project is an 800 megawatt project that is waiting for final permitting from our federal partners, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We expect that permit to happen imminently, we hope. And once that happens, this will be the first kind of commercial scale, large scale offshore wind project that will emerge in this country. It's 800 megawatts. It will connect into Cape Cod. It will be using a GE state-of-the-art 13.6 megawatt turbine. And so, you know, it is teed up, ready to go. And I think the thing for us that's rather exciting, you know, particularly for many of us who have been talking about this, Professor Baker and I, when I was working for the state of Massachusetts and she was out at UMass Amherst, you know, you know, the whole area, particularly in the Northeast, have been talking about this, but it's been kind of a dream forgone. So we think though, with a federal approval this spring, we think we will move to construction, actually onshore cable construction this year, which will be remarkable. We'll do the offshore cable installation in 2022, and then we'll be all systems go in 2023 with, you know, the work on the offshore substation, the beginning of the installation of the foundations, the inter-array cables. And so a huge, I would say, industrial mobilization of a $3 billion project, probably one of the biggest construction projects that the country will see. It will be mobilized from New Bedford, from the great city of New Bedford, at the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. It will be the source of most of the jobs for this new industry, jobs in a what we call a gateway city, a community that needs those jobs, and that we're excited to kind of see move forward. We can talk about, you know, the future and other projects, but maybe just to set the scene, you know, I thought I'd just try to give that context and looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Excuse me. Thank you. Yeah. So I think my kind of most pressing question is, how do we speed up deployment, especially in the US, but even in Europe, we want to actually start moving at even a faster rate. What are the key barriers and what can really be the key accelerators, right? And how fast can we start moving? So maybe I'll hand it back to Damien for a moment. What are your thoughts about this?
I think one of the key accelerators and what you need as a foundation to make this work is providing certainty, right? I think there's a lot of need to actually know if this is real, this is going to happen. We don't want it reversed in a few years, right? And I think providing that certainty gives investment decisions even more concrete standing. And that's been key, right? So I think here, with a commitment from the Biden administration of 30 gigawatts by 2030, it gives a lot more support to get those investments going. It gives more opportunities for the supply chain, which is critical, manufacturing, to make decisions on where we can stand this industry up here in the US. I think those are key parts that have been part of a hindrance, is not having that certainty. I think it's there, and I believe it's actually going to be increasing, and with that kind of confidence, increase the amount of investment that you'll see here in the United States to meet that goal. Accelerants, I really do think the states have been doing the yeoman's amount of work here, right? And I think there has been an incredible amount of work that's been done at the state level, you know, ranging all the way from Maine, what's happening now on the research array and the work that they're doing out there, down to the Carolinas, looking at in North Carolina, how they're exploring their own supply chain days. And so there's a lot of activity, you know, New York with 9 gigawatt goal, you know, New Jersey with 7.5. I mean, it is incredible what amount of work the states have been able to do and get the projects as far along in that process as they can. And now the feds are here to actually bring that across the goal line, right? And having these construction projects and having this permitting. So if we're talking about hindrances, I think if anything, there's a great pipeline of projects lined up, an opportunity to move those forward. Resources are needed, right? Just if you think about it, just the sheer volume of projects that are headed their way, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Department of Interior, as well as allied agencies at the federal level, they need that support. They need those resources to effectively review, responsibly, and proactively get these projects going to meet the climate emergency that we're in. So I think that is a key part, and that's an area that we need to further discuss and how to support them and they're able to get this going.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Bill, do you want to add any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I always love the question about barriers because, people like to focus on the barriers and that's what we do in the industry is we think about what are the market barriers that are going to prevent. And if we just think historically about this, it wasn't really more than 4 or 5, 6 years ago where we really had massive barriers to this industry. Number one, we did not have any market. We didn't have any demand. We did not have any pathway to market. States were not moving forward. You know, give a shout out to the state of Massachusetts and to Maryland and to others who began to kind of leap forward and take really what a risk was. I would say the second biggest barrier was the fear that this was going to be such a costly resource, and it did frighten, I think, a lot of people. You can make the argument for the climate change urgency. You can make the argument that we have to diversify our power supply. You can make the argument that there are going to be significant clean energy jobs here. But in the end, it was, most people thought, it's just too darn expensive. When we first were in Massachusetts and we did a study back in 2014, 2015, we had the Special Initiative of Offshore Wind out of the University of Delaware do a study, and I presented it to the leadership within the Baker administration, and they projected the first 400 megawatts would cost 16.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is triple the wholesale cost at the time, and everybody said even if it was 60, there's no way it's going to be more. It's going to be more expensive than that. And it turns out when Vineyard Wind won that first procurement, we won it for 800 in a competitive solicitation. That LCOE, that levelized cost of energy, was 6.5 cents. It blew people away that our company and now the rest of the industry has been able to kind of bring the cost of energy down in such a significant way and make it almost cost competitive. The other thing I'll just say briefly on barriers and challenges is that the barriers that this industry we have transmission challenges. We have to interface more with marine mammals and commercial fishing. We have issues with ports and accessing ports, but all of them are being solved. They, in kind of collaboration with states, with industry, with stakeholders, and now with the federal government. We are kind of moving forward to, build the solutions, many of which have been, developed in Europe. I mean, some people say to me, well, Bill, aren't you kind of glad that it took so long? Look at when Cape Wind was first envisioned back in, I think, 2005. So maybe, just over 15, 16 years ago, the first turbine that they envisioned using in little Nantucket Sound there was a 1.6 megawatt GE turbine. And think about it, just some years later, we're now using a 13.6 GE turbine. What an evolution. And that growth of the technology has really been key to driving down the cost. And so for that, we have the Europeans to thank.
All right, thank you. And so kind of related to this, as we look to, especially to grow in the US, we're looking largely at the East Coast and somewhat at California. But a question came in, and it's one I'm interested in, is, what needs to happen for offshore wind to be developed in the Gulf of Mexico? Are you guys thinking about the Gulf of Mexico? And, how would we get there?
You want me to go first, Damien, and you can clean it up? So, I love these questions too. However, Aaron, as you said, we only have 7 turbines in the ocean right now. Please let us learn how to walk before we run and run before we sprint. But I love that. I love the ambition though, because, we do have to think about how to set this up as a long-term industry in the US, and we can't just do one project. It has to be a broader industry. So I will say though, right now, I think the biggest opportunities are on the East Coast with fixed bottom technology. We believe that is the most cost effective, that's the most proven. But in order to think about, the new frontier, I mean, the Gulf of Mexico is an interesting opportunity, particularly because of the existing infrastructure in industry, mainly from the oil and gas industry, that can complement the offshore wind industry. However, the wind speed in the Gulf is a lot lower than it is up in the Northeast. So the actual energy capacity is a bit lower. Again, though, back to the issue of technology, we are beginning to see the OEMs, the turbine suppliers, the Siemens and the or I should now say Vestas and GEs of the world, thinking about kind of new technology to tap into a lower wind speed and create a higher capacity factor. So that is rather encouraging. I will say, you mentioned California. Damien is excited about California. I mean, everyone is. It's obviously a huge market with a huge clean energy appetite. However, California has not yet got their act together on developing a pathway to market and thinking about transmission. There is legislation moving to create a 10 gigawatt goal with an interim 3 gigawatt goal by, I think, 2025. So there's some opportunity there. The only thing I will also say is when you think about floating, and Professor Baker, you know more about this than anybody here, and you should dive in, but floating offshore wind is a lot different in the Gulf of Maine, right? Where we're talking maybe 60, 70, 100 meters of water depth versus California, where you're talking potentially over 1,000 meters of water depth. It's a different animal, shall we say. And so, let us, my focus is let's execute projects on the East Coast, fixed bottom. Let's push the envelope with the new frontiers, but recognizing that those are not in the immediate near term, at least in my view.
Great. Yeah. So Damien, I'd love to hear actually also your thoughts on California and floating wind turbines as well.
Definitely. So maybe I'll start in California and work my way backwards to the Gulf of Mexico. So in California, I think the big promise here is that there is an opportunity to really stand up in a more innovative industry in terms of floating. And I think the commitments from California that the state, as well as very much at the local level, is dramatically increasing. And we've seen that over the past year. I think with the new administration, they are very much in line in thinking that part of that 30 gigawatt goal by 2030 is going to include California. There are Defense Department issues that need to be resolved, but I think those lines of communication are open, and that work is actually is being done. And I think you'll see movement in California more so than there's been in the past few years, and that's fairly exciting. And again, how to address that: support development. It's looking at transmission, as Bill indicated. It's also looking at the workforce that needs to stand this up. And I think you'll see a much broader coalition form up in California to realize that opportunity a lot sooner than it's been in the past. So I think floating does have its moment. I think even beyond California, I mean, you have Oregon. There's legislation moving there as well to find the opportunity for potentially 3 gigawatts of offshore wind in California, in Oregon. Maine, of course, as well. And the water depths are very much noted, but I think the technology and how they innovate, because there is no one way to do it, as you'll see in approaching each market individually. In terms of the Gulf of Mexico, and I do want to mention this part, I agree on the resource constraint in terms of the lower wind speeds, but the NREL study, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory study that came out, I believe last year, that kind of got a lot of folks excited, is that they articulated the opportunity there. And I think that's where people are kind of still focused on, in addition to addressing the infrastructure that's in place to help stand it up. But really right now, the focus of the Gulf of Mexico should be what's happening on the jobs front. There are vessels, shipbuilding that's going on right now and to address, because we're going to need a whole new set of vessels to stand this up, right? I mean, there's a benefit to the Europeans that they have a lot of this established, but there's a giant jackup vessel, $500 million investment from Dominion being built in Brownsville, Texas. That's a lot of jobs. We're talking, I think it's over 700 jobs. And that is immediate impact to the economy, as well as addressing how we're going to stand this industry up to comply with US Jones Act vessel compliance. I wish Matt was on this thing so he can talk about how great their investments are on CTVs and other vessels. I mean, commitments of building those ships here. I want to make a clear point. That engine for these CTVs is being built in Indiana. Indiana has nothing to do with offshore wind, but they are very much connected to the supply chain and making sure this industry stands up. So that's an important thing. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico is very much feeding into the economic driver. And so that kind of coordination, but also connection between the coastal states that are driving this in terms of meeting their climate ambitions, as well as the Gulf of Mexico and inland United States, of being able to feed the jobs, also support that supply chain. That's an area that we can't forget.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, it's very, very interesting stuff. So now I have another question. It's kind of related again to speeding things up. It's actually from the, somebody sent this in. And I'll just read the question. So the average amount of time to complete an environmental impact statement is 4.5 years. And about a quarter of these environmental impact statements are challenged in court, which adds an average of another 2 years to the process. And so is permitting reform a priority? The person asks, including retaining permitting reforms from the last administration. And I will throw in my part in how important is, Biden asking the federal agencies to coordinate in the approval process. And so maybe either one, maybe Damien, we can start with you and then go back.
I was going to throw this volleyball over to Bill because he lives and breathes EIS statements and rules, and this is a world that I don't get to enjoy yet. So
Yeah,
great.
I often wonder if archaeologists from another planet come and visit us someday in the future and look at and discover us, who we were as a people, and they would say, geez, they were a very intelligent species, and there was evidence that they actually knew what was happening to their planet, but they couldn't organize themselves to actually respond to the emergency. And I think we are, I listened to the UN Secretary General the other day, talked about we are at the abyss right now with this climate crisis. And there has to be an urgency to move. And, I've been working with my federal partners from the time when I worked for the state of Massachusetts and now in the private sector, for almost, 12 years, going back to that first Cape Wind project. And, the permitting process is a rather incredible process. It's important. It has to be thorough. But at the same time, we need to kind of find some balance, because if, when Vineyard Wind 1, the first commercial scale project, when we submitted, I think we submitted our construction operation plan at the end of 2017. And here we are almost 4 years later, still in this process. I mean, it's broken. It is a broken process. We need to have an accelerated permitting process. It has to be thorough. Stakeholders have to have a voice, but a 2-year process has to be constructed. There is a vision, I know, through a mechanism called Fast 41, where, it is, a permitting dashboard where the feds would commit to a 2-year permitting process. But, I do think we have to kind of get a more macro view of what we're doing here. We're building a clean energy industry. We're creating jobs, but we are responding to the climate crisis. And I do think we have to have a sense of urgency to move these projects forward and get, as they say, steel in the water.
All right, thank you. Okay, also, I want to note that we have Matt Morrissey from Ørsted here. And so, Matt, if you want to kind of back up and just tell us a little bit about your perspective on the future of offshore wind energy and where you're coming from. We were in the middle of talking a little bit about permitting and the importance of speeding up permitting in the US, but if you can give us just a little bit of background on your perspective, that would be great.
You're on mute, Matt.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to chat a little bit today. I'm certain that I missed the front end of this conversation, in which there was talk of optimism about where we are right now as an industry and as we are developing here in the United States. I do want to necessarily go down that road a little bit as well. By way of background, Matthew Morrissey, I head up U.S. markets and strategy for Ørsted. Ørsted is the global leader in offshore wind development, having started the industry, and is honored with 2.9 gigawatts of contracts for 5 states here in the United States. And we're actively developing on all of those. And as someone who has been promoting and advocating for policy and long-term contracts for offshore wind in the public policy sphere and then in the commercial sphere as well, I am certainly someone I've seen the range of where the industry has and how it has evolved. And there's no question, and I'm sure my colleague Bill would agree, that, back in the days of no market, where there was no long-term contracting and no long-term policy framework in any state, nothing can get solved because there's no activity, there's no confidence that is being brought to bear. And as a result of that, there was here in America an endless cycle of what are those movers and who's going to be moving first and what are the challenges. And, the issue of permitting would come forward on the basis of a one-off project like a Fisherman's Energy or a Cape Wind. But in reality, that the larger issues we would never even get to back in the day when there was a market. Today, there is obviously a very robust market that should not be undersold as critical in its importance to see how this industry is going to flourish in the U.S. The issues that Bill is talking about and other issues that are critical path issues we have to solve them. Of course, we need to absolutely drive forward in a more rational, a more transparent, a more predictable way. And there are some very important lessons learned in other industries here in the United States and in Europe as it relates to offshore wind. That's a must. And the Biden administration being in place with key individuals in that administration having the working knowledge of this industry and how it can coexist with other industries is a critical reason to be very optimistic. And there are issues along the way that will cause some difficulty. But in our view, we're at a place now where we are seeing, as we've seen in other markets, a look forward now in an alignment between the federal, states, and local authorities that we've never seen before. And so as that alignment exists, and as we have to support and provide transparent views from a commercial perspective into government so that there are real catalytic moves forward to address things like permitting inconsistency, at the same time, it's up to us to deliver on our promises. As we're building or developing and into building these projects, we more than ever have to show that we've always been sincere in how we are going to bring jobs to the U.S. Through offshore wind. And we have to show that organized labor has an open and transparent seat at the table in our projects. We have to ensure we're spending the time with other stakeholder groups to ensure that they have a clear understanding of where we are on any given issue, and that there's a kind of big tent philosophy so that we are looking to create the necessary flexibility we need to build these very complex infrastructure projects with our stakeholders within the tent, as opposed to trying to keep people outside the tent, again, to maintain some level of flexibility. I think if we do our part and we support government to do its part, the fact is we are in the midst of a climate crisis. We are in the midst of a post-COVID economic downturn or downturn crisis in terms of economic development. We're as shovel ready as any industry or frankly project is or are in the US. And we're very, very optimistic about where things stand right now.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to pivot just for a moment a little bit and point out that this event is sponsored by a center named after Woodrow Wilson, who on the website of the center acknowledged, while a visionary in international affairs, held racist views and implemented racist policies. And I think it's very important to center questions of racial justice and equity right now. And so I would like to hear how the offshore wind industry is addressing current and historic racial inequities, and how can benefits of the offshore wind industry flow to environmental justice communities? So, Damien?
Happy to kick it off. I think that's an excellent question. Couple things to kind of step back and keep in mind is the Biden administration's approach to addressing climate has environmental justice and climate justice central to any decision making. That's a big difference where we were in 2009. When I was in the Obama-Biden administration back in 2009, climate was a priority, clean energy deployment was a priority, but environmental justice integrated to all that decision making was not the case. Where we are today is leaps and bounds different. It is encouraging that not only the feds are involved in how to actually engage these communities, but we're actually also having the states listen. So you'll see just not only on addressing environmental justice communities in these kind of key climate ambitious markets, but also in these solicitations for offshore wind, you're seeing a dramatic increase in procuring contracts and from entities that are minority and women business owned entities, right? So MWBEs and those requirements and focusing on EJ and diversity and inclusion is very much codified into legislation in Massachusetts. It's in procurement targets of 30% in New York, New Jersey, as well as Virginia and Maryland. So that pull factor is important because it addresses these communities. It creates much more of a level playing field, and we're addressing underserved communities. Bill and Matt mentioned it. We are very much at the precipice of starting this industry here in the US. So it's very important we get this right from the start, right? We still have an opportunity to actually stand this up and have these communities directly engaged and involved, not only beyond MWBs, but also workforce training and creating those pipelines for further talent success. And you're seeing this in port development, you're seeing this in jobs training programs within labor communities and things like. So it is very much critical that we start this at the right stage from the beginning, so that we're not looking back 5-10 years from now and saying, I wish we did this, I wish we did that. So EJ and equity is very much at the forefront, and that's something EMBW is constantly thinking about how we can further engage on.
Thanks, Damien. Bill, do you want to add any comments or?
No, I think, yeah, well, I think Damien said it really quite well. I just think a little bit about kind of our first 800 megawatt project being built in a gateway city of New Bedford. It's actually Matt Morrissey's hometown. It's my second hometown because
you wish it was your second hometown.
a lot of time there back in the day. And so I think when we think about the opportunity, we think about the training opportunity, that this is going to be another significant challenge. These are communities, that we're going to be active in, and these are the communities that I believe offshore wind can play a key role in lifting. There's a history of environmental injustice when we think about energy production in this country, and that some of the lowest income communities have borne the brunt of, let's say, the emissions, et cetera. And so in a way, this is a real significant opportunity to actually, it's these communities, these port communities that are sometimes forgotten communities, but these are the communities, because of where they're located and positioned, really are at kind of maybe a front row seat in order to get the benefits of this new industry in terms of economic development and jobs. And so, when we think about our project, we're thinking about workforce training. We're thinking about investing in those types of initiatives so that these communities can reap the benefits. Well deserved.
Great, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
You want to comment?
I would just agree with what Dan and Bill said. And so, the creation of various kinds of workforce development and training focused initiatives around, populations that they've described, critical, absolutely critical. I'll never forget, maybe 10 years ago, being in New Bedford at the school that my kids went to through 5th grade, Carnegie Academy, inner city educational institution. And I was there at the invitation of the principal to talk about offshore wind to a very large group of 800 students, a very large school. And after a brief talk, I took some questions individually, and a 4th grade Cape Verdean girl came forward and she said, do you think that I could actually work on one of these turbines? And I was just, we get involved in policy level discussion all the time. We get involved in, the macro benefits that will come, but to see a 4th grader, little female, is clearly something caught her attention and her imagination. Obviously, I've never let go of that story. I mean, I just really was taken with, that's what this is about. And so, but that does not happen unless the priorities of the federal level, at the state level, and with regard to the companies that are building the projects and there are various subs, all are aligned around the importance of EJ issues and getting to that human being at the end of that talent pipeline. And we are building our facilities and our projects in post-industrial cities like New Bedford and port industrial areas of cities like in Baltimore and Providence or New London, et cetera, Paulsboro. And as a result, we have an opportunity to do something of enormous consequence in our industry. And I know that we're all committed to doing it. It will become part of the legacy, I think, of offshore wind's advance in the United States, that this is, a very, very strong area of focus that's going to yield very clear results.
All right, thank you. That's wonderful. I would love to have that be a legacy of offshore wind. That's putting it. All right, so maybe pivoting again, there's a question from the audience about what are the key improvements in energy storage technology that would accelerate the adoption and implementation of offshore wind? And then they're specifically asking about ultracapacitors, batteries, what do we need? What do you see as the importance of the role of storage in getting really, really large deployments of offshore wind? And I could throw it to Bill, and then I'll move on to.
Well, let me defer to Matt. He's the expert on storage.
Okay, Matt.
Well, storage is the game changer in renewables generally, and that would be, but it would be more important in, areas of solar and onshore wind. The interesting coincidence in offshore wind is a meteorological notion called peak coincidence, where in offshore wind, because of where we're located in the, on the continental shelf and along the Gulf Stream, and the winds of the Gulf Stream essentially just roll unimpeded up the coast and arrive at either the mid-Atlantic or in the Northeast at a very high clip. And it not just in wind speed, but where the power demand on a given day exists. It exists, when people are coming home from work, for instance, and either using electric heat or using microwave ovens or TVs, right? And so around in that late afternoon period, that just happens to be when the wind speeds are most consistent and strongest in offshore wind. And so the power demand is coincident with the power supply in offshore wind. It doesn't solve every problem, but there is a demand and supply dynamic that presents offshore wind in the overall renewable mix as interestingly apropos for the time, given the fuel, the constraints that the region has around natural gas supply. So you put all that together, it's a holy grail in renewables, right? Storage. It's actually not the determining holy grail kind of factor for offshore wind that same way.
Okay, nice. Any other thoughts about that? Maybe I'll throw out kind of a related question. So being that I'm in a university, I'm really interested in hearing about the role of academia in the offshore wind industry. So even in our really globalized world, people still kind of learn and live and work regionally. And so it would be great to have a thriving academic sector, near US offshore wind development. So what do you see the role of US universities as the industry grows? And, how is there a role for policy at either the federal or state level to kind of help with this engagement? I know there's been quite close engagement between universities in Europe and the offshore wind industry. And so we'd love to hear what you're thinking in terms of the US academic sector.
Yeah, maybe I'll start off and let the folks dive in after me. It's funny, I spent a little bit of time getting a degree at Harvard and working there, and was exposed to all the academic centers there and had an enormous appreciation for them. And of course, then I spent some time in the state, and now, of course, I'm in the private sector. And in a way, no one, say, stakeholder really should be the person in charge of really what should be the offshore wind R&D focus priority. I think in a way, and that is kind of what I think the industry is solving for right now, because of this national consortium on offshore wind that is being hosted by New York State, NYSERDA, and kind of really has brought together the states, has brought together us as industry players, and is really bringing together, all of the academic communities to try to develop a common research priority agenda. That is moving forward. DOE is funding and supporting that initiative, and I think that is really the perfect kind of, in a way, the perfect forum to kind of bring stakeholders together to establish an agenda And I think, I think the last number I saw is that about $46 million has been kind of, collected from various stakeholders, including the federal government, to kind of seed this R&D. They do competitive procurements. They have a rating system, and really the best projects that can really advance offshore wind, both in the near term and in the long term, get funded. Because I think academia is going to be central to the advancement and helping us solve, whether it's components and materials, whether it's foundations, installation methods, O&M, how we operate and maintain these facilities over time. I mean, the list goes on. I think about transmission. It's an issue that all of us kind of think about pretty much all the time. But the breakthroughs that we need to see in those kind of areas are just some of where I believe academia can help kind of launch this industry even more aggressively.
I would add that I think, there's a role in kind of the pockets of data that may not exist, or at least it can keep, frequency on. I think there's a greater need for marine animal data sharing, and looking at how some of these environmental impacts and what the role of both climate resilience and mitigation will be. So I think there's a lot of data sharing that can occur at the academic level in partnership with the states, as well as the federal government and developers and industry in general in this space. So that's going to be critical. But an area that I think is going to be just key to the actual establishment and standing up this industry is community colleges, right? So I think there's a big role for community colleges in actually playing the ability to get these workers trained, getting them more specific into some of the trades. So there's an area there where we should be focusing on. I mean, you see this from, working on vessels to potentially, having a particular niche market and development on the workforce side. This is happening already, right? So that commitment's coming from states and working with community colleges and state schools, I think, is going to be critical in this space too. So there's a lot here. I think this is still very much I would say, a blank slate in developing where those resources go. So I think the commitments and seeing where the academic needs are, but also the opportunity for those local areas to be developed is the next step here.
All right, great. I have a question. Matthew, are you trying to talk to us?
You're on mute.
Okay.
Matt, you're still on mute.
No, we can't hear you if you're talking to us. I'm sorry.
Bill has just said to himself, that's the smartest thing that Morrissey said. I was trying to second what Dan was saying. Community colleges are a critical path pipeline of talent that we need, and their linkage to labor and making that partnership efficient and work for all involved is critical. I would just say one more thing about the research agenda that Bill spoke about, and that is, in the early days, there was not a coordinating function. There was just too few faculty members necessarily that were plugged into this emerging industry as one would expect. And as a result, different companies would commit to different types of institutions to do different sorts of things that all seemed reasonable and certainly effective in that one pillar of activity that particular principal investigator may have been interested in that company. Today we are in a very 3.0 kind of environment as relates to the partnership between industry and universities, and to the extent that federal and state government can work with us in the format that is now been funded to bring together this commonality of understanding and purpose about what really is required to move all of the various lanes of industry forward, the better, the more efficient, the faster, and frankly, as a result, the more research dollars will flow, as long as there's relevance to the agenda. And basically, the current setup that exists right now would suggest we should be very optimistic about where that's going.
All right, great, thank you. So another question coming in from outside is saying, major oil companies are moving in with aggressive bids in connection with offshore wind. From the point of view of the consumer, this development is accelerating the pace of project developments. But are there issues where consumers should be concerned about this trend, the trend of oil companies getting involved?
I think the three of us could agree that we don't believe any of the oil companies should come into the offshore wind industry. Ørsted used to be one, but they saw the light. Avangrid Renewables is, obviously not, and neither is ENBW. So I think, would be unified in supporting that position. However, taking a more serious note, I think when we think about this industry and kind of I think the three of us kind of feel almost an urgency when we think about the climate emergency for this industry to really get stood up and play a role in building this clean energy industry. I think everyone has to be, everybody has to welcome, everyone has to compete. I think I think we feel quite confident to compete against any of these key players. But in a way, we all have our parochial interest, and we'll all kind of elbow each other out of the way when we can. But at the same time, there is an urgency to build this industry. I think we all feel that, and so maybe having the oil majors come in is a sign that finally the major players are actually seeing this industry build and move forward and be a credible investment, right? So that's part of it too. And so it's just a couple of thoughts off the top of my head on that topic.
Yeah, I would say that the oil and gas, companies, traditional sources of energy, have a very clear role in transitioning to a clean energy economy, and they see the opportunity here, right? I think where they invest their dollars makes a big difference, and it shows commitment, and I think you'll see more of that. And the other part of this is that looking at their workforce, I mean, anecdotally, I get interest and questions from folks, in Houston, to say, I have this skill set. I've worked in oil and gas, for over a decade. What role do I have in offshore wind? And the answer is there's many. There's a lot of transferable skills. And so if we're talking about those, that next chapter where we're headed as a country, but also a clean energy economy, where those jobs are and how those roles are filled, there's very much a lot of expertise within oil and gas that will find itself in offshore wind. And that's exciting because we do want to create as much opportunities as we can.
Back in the day, what I'd like to think of the person asking that question, I'd like to think that person is a student who is really deeply concerned about environmental degradation of fossil fuel driven enterprises. So I'm going to answer the question from that vantage point. When the offshore wind industry was just a twinkle in the eye of some folks, the major utilities in the United States were against it as a source of legitimate, renewable, scalable power generation for various reasons, most of which were cost. At least that was the public admission at the time. But the sense was that when we were solid enough in the public policy realm and developing and educating lead elected officials around the importance of this one particular renewable technology and what kind of cost declines the industry globally has seen, they became legislators, elected officials at the state level became much more confident about passing these laws. Once that happened, utilities did come around, and that was seen as a major factor in the embrace of offshore wind back in the day. I think we're looking at the same thing with the oil majors. The fact that they're coming in is a tilt in the direction, undeniably, that they recognize that the world is changing and they need to follow suit. They are so large and their spending capacity is so vast that even a small percentage of what they're doing will translate into huge growth for renewables, and that then begets more growth in renewables. I think it's important. So I see it as a positive, but it's a subtle issue that does deserve continued conversation. One issue is this: what we're seeing in the markets, in the solicitations at the state level, is we're seeing undeniably competition for contracts. That's a very healthy thing to bring down cost. When we start seeing truly opportunistic pricing strategies, perhaps by oil majors as an example, we do want to keep an eye on that, only from the vantage point that if the priorities of the states are both climate change mitigation through the scalability of offshore wind procurement and job creation, And if, skinny bids that are commercially a little unnatural, but they're more opportunistic in their kind of nature because these oil majors want to come into the market, which is great. We want to make sure that there's a balance, and we want to make sure we're looking at is the state's priorities, both the jobs plus the competitive pricing to bring down our climate agenda, that we're not sacrificing the other. Eventually, there is a zero-sum game. These are big projects, but they're also big in the expense, and we have to make sure that that duality of the agenda that exists here at the national, state, and local level is also considered.
Okay, great. Then I have another question on, it says, based on the experience in Europe with offshore wind, what are the most effective strategies for addressing the concerns of commercial fisheries? And then, because someone had earlier mentioned that in the Gulf Coast, people are also, the fisheries are already concerned. So do you have any thoughts, and especially on what has been learned from Europe? I think that's a great question for this particular panel. Anybody want to start with that?
Well, I think I'll give it a shot. I think the first thing to recognize really is that, the fishery, let's say in the North Sea, is a heck of a lot different of a fishery than we have in the Northeast. The Northeast has probably a more significant, more valuable, fishery. So we shouldn't kind of think it's a apples to apples comparison. Number two is that, I've been engaged with fishermen on the subject of offshore wind dating back to, really 2011, where, I was one of the folks that negotiated an agreement with fishermen in order to actually site where some of these projects are south of the vineyards, south of Martha's Vineyard, south of Nantucket, that Ørsted owns, that Avangrid Renewable owns, that ENBW will someday own. These are the areas, though, that we gathered data. We brought fishermen to the table. We used a great scientist out of the School of Marine Science and Technology at UMass Dartmouth to really kind of guide us and let the data, indicate the outcome. And we did. We reduced our planning area by almost 60%, and we came up with really the current wind energy areas with fishermen at the table. That was a significant, good stakeholder process. Was every single fisherman consulted? Was everyone happy? Of course not. But, it was done, I think, in the best way possible to kind of get an outcome. But the broader issue here is that this is new for American fishermen, particularly fishermen in the Northeast. This is a change. They've been fishing these waters for 300 or 400 years. There is a lot of unknown. There is an enormous amount of engagement that this industry, the two industries, have had together. Is it ever enough? Probably not. But I think we as an industry have been working very hard to bring them to the table, to educate them, and for us to learn from them, to think about how we make accommodations so that we can both mutually coexist. We at Vineyard Wind believe that we can do that. We have entered into aggressive agreements with fishermen in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and other states to provide mitigation to offset any potential economic loss. We have engaged with them on the siting and changed our arrays of how the turbines will be laid out so that we can, again, impact them less. But this is going to be a key issue. I think we have to be respectful, though, of the fishermen and the fear of the unknown that they have. I think it's a rational and natural issue. And but again, we are convinced that these two industries can mutually coexist.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We're actually down to our last minute, so it's about time to close it out. But thank you to the three panelists. This has been really interesting. I think we have learned a lot about how you're thinking about offshore wind. I do feel like I'm pretty optimistic, and I feel like the answers that I got from you were very reasonably optimistic. For everyone who's listening, I just want to point out that there is a recording, and this will be available on the Wilson Center website. And so with that, we'll say thank you to everyone. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it.